Good afternoon. My name is Dean Andreas Loewe, and I'm the Dean of St Paul's Cathedral, Melbourne, and the Chair of the Melbourne Liturgical Committee. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this reflection on Charles Sherlock's book, Australian Anglicans Performing APBA. I would like to acknowledge the country on which we all meet in different parts of Australia, but each sovereign land's never ceded. As we gather together, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we're gathered and on which we live and work and worship. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders who are engaging with this resource. This year marks the 25th anniversary of a prayer book for Australia, and many of us will have copies like this, the red brick. It's been well prayed through, you'll be pleased to know, here in the Deanery, and it's really quite a terrific resource. We are delighted that we have with us members of the current Liturgy Commission of General Synod of the Anglican Church of Australia and previous ones. And so I'd like to introduce you in turn. Charles Sherlock is the author of the work Australian Anglicans Performing APBA. He was a member of the Liturgical Commission that prepared that prayer book and has been teaching and reflecting on theology and liturgy for over 5 decades. Reverend Dr Elizabeth Smith, who is joining us from WA. She is the mission priest in the parish of the Goldfields based in Kalgoorlie. And she is also a long-term member of the Liturgy Commission. And our final panelist is Canon Dr Rhys Bezzant, who is the senior lecturer in church history at Ridley, Melbourne. He's an ordained Anglican minister here in Melbourne, has worked in university and parish settings, and is the director of the Jonathan Edwards Centre Australia. As I was reading your book, Charles, I was reflecting on some words that you said right at the beginning, that this book is a reflection on another book which came to life during the prime ministership of John Howard and its relevance for today, and you were questioning that. So I wonder whether you could reflect on that, and also on the very interesting title that you've chosen, that this is a performance of this prayer book. And when your reflections are giving us both a commentary and a history of the genesis of that prayer book.
Well, the metaphor of performing, I think, is a very significant one. I got it from a book by Francis Young, The Art of Performance, which is about reading scripture. And some people say, well, performing is, imitation or fake, but that's not the point at all. It's performing means to act out something. So Australian Anglicans, that's what it's about, worship, but worship isn't just about liturgy. It's about liturgy and lifestyle. So Australian Anglicans Performing APBA is saying APBA inevitably is a prayer book of words, but they're words that invite us to perform the gospel through the ministries of word, common prayer and sacrament liturgically. But you perform them, and God is the audience, not anyone else. You perform them in order that we may perform that gospel in daily life. And obviously it's a pair with the first book, Performing the Gospel in Liturgy and Lifestyle, which started as a commentary on APBA, but I got to 9 chapters before I'd got to text, space, music, all those sorts of things. The title is deliberately designed to say, yes, this is basically a commentary on a prayer book. It's basically a book of words. But worship is about far more than words. It's about acting out the gospel, and we act it out as we are formed in liturgy in order to live it in the world. So it's about both the tradition of liturgy and hopefully an invitation and encouragement to mission.
And then this prayer book, this performance script, as it were, that we as Australian Anglicans do use on a daily basis, is 25 years old this year. that's a huge accomplishment to celebrate. How do you see its longevity, Charles?
Oh, I don't. I'm quite sure that this will be the last, full hard copy print liturgical text that Australian Anglicans will use. I mean, my hope would be that the next one might be ecumenical, if there is such a thing. But I think the time has come for resources to be issued online. And that's taken up in the book, as Elizabeth has noted. There's been publications since, and the book includes commentary on those that have been published since. But if there isn't going to be another definitive, printed, checked every word prayer book, then a full commentary which says this is why what it is what it is, I hope will provide foundations about long-term heritage and principles to guide us in the world where it could easily be anything goes without too much thought. So if you look at the index, I was quite delighted, in fact, to see the name which comes up most commonly is Thomas Cranmer. But the second name is Gilbert Sinden, who had a lot to do with AAPB. And I hope in future there'll be other names of people who aren't yet bored who are taking up the torch of liturgy for Australian Anglicans and hopefully an ecumenical Australian church in the future.
That's a very good segue to present-day members of the Commission, and I'd like to open up to both Elizabeth and to Rhys to say, well, what stood out in Charles's book for you in particular?
What stands out, Charles, is your amazingly generous spirit. You have given us the rationale for this book with the most positive spin on everything that's in it, even though you're at the same time explaining how tough it was to get some of these things thought out, written up, and then navigated through all the processes of authorisation. You yourself have this spirit of huge affection and respect for the tradition you inherited. You're a Book of Common Prayer boy from childhood. So you honour that part of the tradition, but you have lived the changes and you have done it in your own inimitable style of wanting to find the best of everything that has come forward in the wake of the BCP, and to make all of that as accessible and as rich and as positive for Australian Anglicans as possible. So even when you're telling a pretty bumpy ride, the story of a pretty bumpy ride, you're saying, look at it this way. There's a reason for this. And we can put this angle on it to help us appreciate it. And I really value that because there's a lot of grumpiness around. There's a lot of, why didn't they do this? And how come the other's not there? And you actually give us the reasons why, and you give it with an invitation to take those things on board with the same generosity of spirit. You say it's not the perfect prayer book. None of us thought it was, but it's the one we've got, and you give us lots of reasons to cherish the result of all of those years of work from Cranmer's work in the Reformation through to your own work and the work of the people who provided APBA in a draft form to the General Synod. But the generosity of spirit is something I hope is catching, because we need that in order to give each other space to do our best performances of the gospel according to this book, and to recognise other people's performances as encompassed in a warm, large space, as large as possible, which the covers of the book open up for us.
Thank you. That's a lovely reflection of being set in this wide space, Charles, that you're holding in tension, and enabling us to share in the story of the genesis of this work, but also setting up for us the expectation that our outlook on liturgy is one that is outward looking and enabling. Rhys, what stood out for you?
Well, even picking up Elizabeth's comments, Charles, when you mentioned a few minutes ago that this would probably be the last book that we get to write for the Anglican Church in Australia, you made that point without seemingly having lots of bitterness or regret, that you recognised that this was a new kind of world for education and for thinking about texts. And I wanted to jump in and say, but Charles, you've given so much of your kind of academic life to this, surely there must be a little bit of kind of resentment towards the fact that the book might not be reproduced, or there might not be a further version of it. I was going to ask, at some time, I'd love to hear what you think are the opportunity costs in there being no longer a book, or we have this book for the time being, but no likely revision of the book. But secondly, I'm not a BCP from birth kind of person. So lots of the stories that Charles presents, background of BCP or of AAPB as well as APBA, for me are just gold. For me are just gold. I don't have those stories as part of my own story. So as a teacher of liturgy, they are just wonderful in helping me get context, helping me see balance, helping me understand not just the battles that were involved in getting to the text as we have it, but putting the best, in Elizabeth's language, the best spin on it, helping people to see that this is actually manages some very difficult and delicate negotiation. So for that, we can be really thankful. Your theological approach means that you're not just examining a text, you're helping us think about the text historically and theologically. And Charles, I really commend that. I really appreciate that in your teaching.
Thank you. Do you want to ask that question about the opportunity cost of not having a book?
I kind of did, didn't I? Yes, Charles.
Why don't we ask Charles?
Well, the opportunity mainly is there is for creativity. I mean, when the prayer book production committee signed a contract, in that contract there was a clause allowing for electronic publication. And when it was about to be printed, that went out to places and to say, okay, what do you want to do about getting it electronically? And nobody was interested all of a sudden. And eventually, after a lot of hoo-ha, I ended up working with these Norwegian software developers to produce ePray. The General Synod Standing Committee was worried about authorising something electronic because they thought it could be changed. And my point was, that's wonderful. You know what I mean? You want liturgy to be available locally for adaptation. I don't mean changed in basics, you know what I mean? But the opportunity there is for creativity. And so, and the work which is the Commission has been publishing since, I think demonstrates that. One comment I made was that Holy Communion 2009 is the first Eucharistic rite in Australia, and I think possibly beyond, in which there is nothing of Cranmer, not a thing. And yet, having prayed and used it, it feels right. You know what I mean? So the opportunity negative, though, is to encourage the idea that each parish priest is really a rector, a ruler in their own place, and can, you know, impinge on their people whatever they feel like. Now, there's a fair bit of that around anyway, and the sense of a loss of common prayer, that congregations who only ever see a pew sheet of one service, PPP or second order communion or whatever, can be denied the sense that this is a small segment of a wide tradition which covers you from birth to death, from, you know, New Year's Day to Christmas and everything in between. So that's the possible loss, but that's a matter of, you know, good liturgical training, good practice, you know, prayerful application of the gospel, and that's got to go on. And the tradition of having it all in one book only started in 1549. It's a Church of England and now Anglican distinctive, and I think it's one of those things that I think we can let go, which is why I've said I've never liked the principle of uniformity, which is written into the Book of Common Prayer, but I coined the phrase principle of coherent diversity about APBA, which, except for pages 132 and 133, I think is true. Those that let the reader understand. But as a way of offering to the church a principle to say coherent diversity, I think, is a good mission strategy liturgically in a postmodern age.
Elizabeth, do you have a response or feedback that you'd like to bring in at this point?
I think that it's great to have the book. I'm glad it exists. I'm glad you can still buy the brick. I hope everybody does buy the brick. I hope everybody gives a copy of the brick, either in its red form or its little cute plastic pseudo leather miniature version, to every confirmation candidate, every adult baptism candidate, every child doing a first communion preparation. It's really important to have the brick. And the brick is never going to be enough. It wasn't even enough the minute it was published, because it didn't have Holy Week and Easter in it, because that was too hard to get through the synodical process. It didn't have various other things that Charles occasionally points out. You must, incidentally, readers of this book, you must read the footnotes. They're hilarious in many places and enlightening in others.
They
Charles points out that there's a serious omission in the prayers for various occasions, that there's not one for the main Australian religion, namely sport, and which comes in after or before Charles' shopping.
Yeah, that's religion. Yeah, I think sports
so
ahead
even when it came out, the book wasn't enough. But the book gives good bones, both for the flesh that the book has put on those bones, but also for the subsequent creativity. Also for what can spring out of the hard work of previous generations. And sometimes it'll build pretty closely on what's already there, and sometimes it'll go, I get that skeleton, now I'm going to put flesh on it that's not Cranmerian, but it's in the same theological zone, but with a 21st century flavour to it. So we need to have this book. It probably is the only book that we'll have, but we do need it to be the foundation on which subsequent creativity gets built. And the beauty of Charles's book is that it explains why the foundation is what it is, where the solid agreed things are, how different priorities got set, where the arguments were the most intense down to punctuation marks and that sort of thing. So Charles gives us a reason for honouring APBA, a reason for continuing to treat it as the treasure on which subsequent Australian liturgical text and action can be built.
Thank you. Charles, you made oblique reference to a prayer that wasn't prayed through and yet made it into the prayer book. I don't want to repeat the story which you tell in your book, but I wonder whether you as members of the Liturgical Commission would be able to reflect a little bit for those viewers who aren't every day engaged in the writing, shaping and wordsmithing of liturgy, something of the process of how does a prayer come out of the drafting phase into a prayer book.
We went through an agreement on principles that we're trying to do, somebody drafting it, then we would pray it, and then we would invite selected congregations, theological colleges to pray it. And that's what didn't happen with that prayer. But I'd like Elizabeth to answer that. She's done more doing of this stuff than I have, I think.
Usually what happens is, in post-APBA liturgical creativity, usually what happens is somebody writes something for a very defined local event. And it might be the monthly all-age children-friendly service on Saturday afternoons. And you know it goes quite well in their parish. And it gets tweaked a bit because you can tell when the 3-year-olds are wriggling and when the 12-year-olds have wandered off. And then that person brings that text, the revised, workshopped, piloted text, to the Liturgy Commission and says, what do you reckon? And then everybody has an opinion about that. They have opinions about the punctuation. They have opinions about the theological metaphors. They have opinions about the sequencing and the structure. And some of them have opinions about historical liturgical forerunners of this thing that need to be more highly marked or less, more deeply buried. And we also do a lot of reading it aloud in different voices, because a text on the page is a very different creature from that text heard by the ears. So there's an awful lot of argument and jots and tittles and chewing things over, and sometimes theological arguments. And then once we've got our rough consensus around the table, we say, okay, take this away and test it with your mob of 12-year-olds or your little group. See how it goes. Come back with your feedback. And if that flies, then we fix it up a bit more, and then we might send it out to the bishops and say, would you like to let your mob have a go at this and get back to us with your feedback, or would you just like to read it and tell us what you like or don't like? And they do. So that's kind of the pattern that we have.
Thank you. I'd like us to think a little bit about, with and now, what are the kind of big questions that this generation of liturgists needs to engage with? And one of the things that springs to mind really is the engagement with Indigenous liturgical writing and the reflection of Indigenous culture within our prayer book.
The book APBA does try and engage with some prayers and some themes, Indigenous Australians. I think on the whole, though, Indigenous Australians are using other kinds of liturgies that aren't in English, because English is probably not their first language more often than not. And, friends are involved in prayer book revision in the Northern Territory for Indigenous groups that they're working with. So I think our book has tried. It's not for me to decide how successfully that Indigenous engagement is, but I think the Indigenous question is much bigger than this book, as we kind of allow freedoms to our Indigenous brothers and sisters to create their own liturgies or a pidgin prayer book, which will probably be much simpler with fewer options than the book we have, but thereby will be able to be learned by rote, and that will be really important for some.
Charles, what's your thinking?
Myself and the then chair visited the Northern Territory, to meet with people and try and sort this out. And it was just obvious that the sort of prayer book that a prayer book was would not suit the liturgical needs of many Anglican communities in, up north. Mm-hmm. The good thing about it, of course, is those communities are very coherent and homogeneous, so that what they do speaks to them in a way that it doesn't for our very mixed situations elsewhere in Australia. We try to ensure that no prayer, no matter how formal, in a first order Holy Communion, for example, the most formal you get, would cause issues from someone who's using the text from an Indigenous, strong sense of country, little sense of the whole English historical tradition. They must be able to pray that, as much as contributions from Indigenous Australians must be able to be prayed with integrity by folks like me who go back 6 generations in English and 1 in Irish descent.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts and reflections?
The voice and place of First Nations people in Australia has changed enormously in the 25 years since the publication of APBA. Awareness by the rest of us of the significance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and culture and languages has grown. Recognition that native title always existed and still does is percolating through. Recognition that truth-telling about the colonial origins of the Church of England in Australia and the damage it did, as well as the gospel that it brought, all of those things have shifted hugely in Australian wider culture since 1995. So I think that the book has very little in it that is specific to the place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australian Christianity. It's got a nod here and a nod there. That's just not enough. I think this is one of the areas where big creativity led by, called for by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglicans needs to happen. And it's not painless. It's not coming up against Cranmer here. It's not measuring against something in the past that we need to replicate just in modern language. This is a change of heart for all Australians. And every time any one of us in a historic building, as I do every Sunday, get up and preach, I'm preaching in a building built on stolen land. And that consciousness was not around in 1995. And the willingness to speak that way and tell and do that truth telling wasn't there in 1995, but it's rising and will continue to rise. And until there's a voice to Parliament, and until there's a treaty, and until the truth is told and honoured by all Australians, long-term, medium-term, and came into the country yesterday, our book will be not sufficient for our needs.
That's profound reflections there on a central theme that sets some kind of future perspectives of the work of the Commission, to think with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christians as to what are the resources that we need to create. When you saw this book come to birth, did you imagine that there would be Mandarin translations of it? As I've had the privilege of helping to bring about through the work of our local Mandarin clergy here in creating a Mandarin version of the principal services of APBA.
Yeah, absolutely, because my first career was being a missionary in Chinese, and the Chinese is ideographical. You think through pictures. Is quite different to thinking through words and syllables. And so liturgically, the picture language sort of works with it being a drama. So yes, I had hoped, if you like, and I was delighted to see Mandarin emerging more strongly in Melbourne, as I trust it will elsewhere in Australia. It's a beautiful language.
And it's a fabulous resource to have for the wider church as well. Now, a number of concluding questions to the author. Everybody pictures, when writing a book, their reader. Whom did you have in mind, Charles, when you were writing this book?
Anyone involved in helping lead services using APBA on Sundays, in bedsides, in daily, anyone helping using it, obviously clergy, but more beyond that, the lots and lots of people who help lead the worship and who pray it. So you've got, on the one hand, people who do the planning and the initiating and the choosing and who are tempted to be rectors in the bad sense. On the other hand, you've got the actual prayers, and they're the people who matter most. Will this commentary help feed their performing the gospel as it shapes them in church and as it, they shape it in their living?
Every author also has got favourite and not so favourite bits of a book. What was your personal highlight in the book? What did you enjoy writing? What flowed from the feather?
Thanksgiving for a Child, because I think that speaks to the whole issue of gender in a particular way, and had the most difficult thing was drafting funerals for an infant who's died in the time of birth. So that combination is what spoke to me most. What I realised I'd learnt a lot more than I'd realised from. I mean, I taught theology for a long time, but 26 years on the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, where you actually get to feel more why Roman Catholics hold what they do, helped me a lot in writing the chapters on the Eucharist, which I still think are basically shaped by Cranmer. That's for others to judge.
Are there questions to Charles from our other panelists?
Charles, what was the hardest section in this book to write?
The hardest section to write was probably the chapters on marriage, because I had least to do with drafting them. I mean, I was a partner to them. I've only ever taken one wedding, and that was of a couple under very special circumstances. But on the other hand, I've watched my wife take loads of them, and she's brilliant at it. I'm going to give her a plug, both in parish and cathedral and other settings, and some boundary settings that some people might question. So that was the chapter that, in a sense, I was least, practitioner aware of. But on the other hand, it reflects strongly on a whole lot of gender issues, which were very prominent in the 90s and in this book, and the Commission was determined to, face them. In fact, our most strong discussion on the Commission was how the place of Ephesians 5 would appear in the lectionary. That's the one where we really nearly lost tempers over.
I want to say, Charles, rather than ask, I want to say that I think an important intended audience for this book is the many clergy now working in Australia who did their formation and imbibed their Anglican liturgical sensibilities in other parts of the Anglican Communion than Australia. So certainly Mandarin speakers, but Dinka speakers and all the other Sudanese communities who have made their homes with us. People from the Church of England who still sometimes have a residual unexamined assumption that surely the rest of the Anglican world is somehow derived from Church of England models. People from South Africa, people from Sri Lanka, people from North America. I think this book will really help them to come to terms perhaps with the strengths and some of the limitations of Australian Anglican inheritance and the many places that it's come from. So I think that people who didn't start out Australian Anglican, or people who didn't start out Anglican and who need a little bit of immersion in the waters of Anglican joys and controversies, liturgical and other worship related, need to have this book and to sit down and read it with APBA in one hand and your book in the other, making them more able to use the book in the spirit that it was intended, a generous, inclusive, door-opening kind of book for local enculturation of Anglican worship.
The place of the Diocese of Sydney is, in my opinion, often misunderstood, sometimes deliberately. And I've tried very hard to face that question and say, people don't realise how helpful they were in preparing APBA. There were some disagreements, but I want all Anglicans to enjoy, good, biblically based, but 3rd century liturgical work that helps form us for the mission of God in the 3rd millennium, in the very diverse places from Redfern to the outbacks of Kalgoorlie, and the Aboriginal and immigrant communities. And that's something that I hope this book's, the storying of APBA and the way it engages with those debates, I would hope will encourage listening and learning rather than name calling and, all that.
I think that's a wonderful concluding point to say this is really about the whole nation in all its theological and in its geographical and in its demographic diversity. Charles is very generously willing to be available to enter into further conversation with groups, with deaneries or local diocesan synods, and contact can be made with Charles through Broughton Publishing. The book can be ordered online on the Garrett Publishing website and is available. It will be formally launched on the 27th of October, which marks the actual 25th anniversary of the work. I'd like to thank all of you for participating. offer warmest congratulations to Charles for his accomplishment in producing this very fine and handsome volume here, and to my colleagues Rhys and Elizabeth, both for their work on the Liturgical Commission, but also on their sharing with us this afternoon in taking Charles's thoughts and reflecting on them. So thank you very much, all of you.